Hello and welcome to Piwik PRO YouTube video series. Topic of the video: CDP data import, enriching profiles with data from Mailchimp. So what we're gonna learn? We'll go through the process of setting up an ongoing profile enrichment of CDP profiles with data from Mailchimp. In other words, how to import data from Mailchimp. We'll also explain how to check if profile was successfully added by creating audience example. While we're going to use Mailchimp as an example, a lot of the steps will look more or less similar in other platforms that support webhooks. Okay, let's dive in. Before we begin data import, I created here an audience, users from Mailchimp, to see later, once we begin the data import, whether the profiles, the user contacts, Mailchimp contacts are coming through as intended. For that, I've created an audience with custom attribute Mailchimp status. So that's a custom attribute that you would first need to create under attributes. Obviously, name could be different. You would have to click in here. So let me find it. So that's a Mailchimp status. That's a made up name. It can be whatever. And then the type I've created to be string. So it's not a number because it's a string. The value will be subscribe. And the aggregation is last. So we get the last value. Now the value will be subscribe. And because that is the value that Mailchimp will be sending with the data import for the users with that kind of status, subscribe status. In other words, this is not the made up value as it is in the case Mailchimp status. That could be different, but the subscribe, that's the value that I was checked with the Mailchimp documentation beforehand. So if you were to do the data import in other platform other than Mailchimp, you would have to, if you were to use similar sort of audience, you would have to check that value with each and every platform. In case of a Mailchimp, that's a subscribe. Okay, so let's start the setup of data import. So I'm going to go to data import. In here, I have few setups. Because they are gray, it means that they are inactive. This one is active, but if I were to switch to this one, we can see that it's green. You can make them active by clicking on this button. However, I want to create a new one, so I'm going to click on import data, and I'm going to call it data import from Mailchimp. In here, I have a webhook that I'm going to copy and paste into the Mailchimp to connect those two platforms. Now, before I do that, let me click on synchronize data button. Now, notice that it doesn't do anything for me. That's because the platforms, CDP and Mailchimp, are not connected yet. So let's copy this webhook URL. So you can see it was copied, and let's move on to Mailchimp. In Mailchimp, once you log in, I already logged myself in. To your left, you'll see few sections. Under audience sections, we need to go to all contacts. Now, I have some fake contacts in here, so they're not real. But if you were to go to settings and then scroll down underneath in here, you'll find webhooks. So if you click on that, that'll get you to this page where you can add a webhook. So you can click on create a new webhook. And in here, we can paste the URL that we've copied from here. So I'm going to do that, paste it. Now in here, we have a few sections. Here, by default, those all options are checked, but you can uncheck them. And basically what it means, what types of updates should we send? So basically what sort of data we want to have in sync between Mailchimp and CDP, meaning what data we want to import whenever those statuses of user profile contacts, as we call them in Mailchimp, would change. Underneath here, we only send updates when changes made by a subscriber. So this means that the user basically used some sort of form on our website that we may have taken from Mailchimp, and that way how they subscribe to our newsletter or any sort of email communication. Or whenever, the second option is whenever we do it by ourselves. So in a moment, I'm going to add a new contact manually, and we can sort of check that box whenever we want to sync data when that sort of update is being made. And third one is via API. I'm going to leave it unchecked, and I'm just going to click on save. So now we've created a webhook sync between Mailchimp and CDP. The next step would be to map the data that we're going to be sending to Piwik PRO. So in order to do that, because there's no way of testing the webhook, what we need to do, we need to add the contact manually. And that will give us a starting point to mapping the data that we're going to be able to receive. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to all contacts, and I'm going to click on add contacts, and I'm going to add a single contact. So let's come up with some fake email. I'm going to add Michael Walker, Piwik.pro. Now, what we're going to add here, it's up to us. We could fill in all that data, mostly the data that we would be able to map when sending profiles to CDP. However, I'm just going to keep those 3 to keep things simple. And down here, because I'm adding contact manually, I need to specify that I do have a permission to use that. So in my case, obviously, I'm going to do that, because that's not a real contact, but then we would need to have the permissions to use email for any sort of email communication and perhaps for syncing data with CDP. So I'm going to click on add a contact. And in here, if I click on that, notice that now I can do something. Before, I was having this message that it's not possible to sync data, and now I can sync the data. There are 2 steps here. Well, the first step we went through that. The second step is we need to sync the identifier between 2 platforms. In our case, that's obviously going to be an email because that's a Mailchimp. But in some other platforms, that could be some sort of customer ID or any sort of unique identifier that we use within Piwik PRO and in third-party platforms. In our case, that's a Mailchimp, so it's going to be email. So in here I can see what sort of data I can use, and obviously that's the data, those are the keys that were sent from Mailchimp. So I'm going to use email, obviously, and on Piwik PRO's end we have an option to use cookie ID or user ID. In most cases we will be using user ID because user ID is a custom identifier that we sort of going to use to match profile data between different platforms. So I'm going to use user ID, and from in here I have all the keys and values that were sent with that sort of sync. Notice that we have an email, we have a name, surname, or some other information like list ID, etc., etc. So I just want to use those 3 and one more, but I'll get to that in just a second. Now, I don't need to use email because I already linked the data using user identifier, so I'm going to leave that unchecked, but I do want to use first name. Now, if you don't have an attribute for first name, I have a name, but if you don't have a name, you can click on add custom attribute. Once you add it, you'll be able to sort of create it. So let's click on that just to show you how you could do that. In here, you would provide the name, so name, whatever. Here, type string and aggregation. So aggregation, in case of a name, because it's not going to change, we can choose either first or last, but in some other cases, we could use first and last, or a list if you want to store all different values across time. If we want to store list unique, if we want to keep data that is unique across time. But in my case, it's first and last. It doesn't matter which one. I'm going to use first, but last could be good as well because nobody changes their name often. It doesn't matter in this particular example. So I'm going to use first. I would use first, but I'm going to cancel that because I already have one. And second name, I need to check that first and then choose surname. Lastly, in here, there's more data. So we can, I went to another page. We need to use subscribe. So that's the status of a subscription. Remember when I was showing you the audience at the very beginning, this is the sort of data that we want to also send from Mailchimp to CDP so that we know that we can send the communication to users based on their subscription status. In this case, that's subscribe. So I'm going to check that. And if you remember the name of the attribute, that was Mailchimp status, and now I can save it. Now, because that was a test, a data import, we see failed data import and successful data import, and we didn't add that very user into our system. So just to keep it clean, so we don't send the data to some fake account. In here, you can see successful data imports, any sort of errors. So if I were to click on that, we can see empty payload, again, because that was a test. In here, we can see details of that data import. So basically the keys and the values that we decided to map them with when data is being transferred from Mailchimp to Piwik PRO. Another thing is that I'm going to add another user once again, so that way you will see in my audiences here that I have a profile that will be added based on the subscription status. So again, this time I'm going to use Michael Walker 2. So Michael Walker 2, and I'm going to give the permissions and I'm going to add the contact. First, let's go to data import you'll see that now we have 2 successful data imports. Another one is Michael Walker 2, so that's the one. I can click on this particular link and that will get me to the profile, but I also can show you that now we have a first profile in our audience. So if we were to create the audience, we now have our first profile. I can click on the profile here, or I can go to data import and go to the profile by clicking on this link. That will get us to the user basically data, so profile data. Now at the moment I have only data based on the Mailchimp data, because in order to have full profile data between the website behavior and a Mailchimp, we need to match that user across website and across Mailchimp. So I'm going to copy that email and I'm going to go to incognito mode, the incognito mode on this demo website, which is synced with the CDP that we just seen. I'm going to register. So I'm going to use, and I need to provide that email. So that's my username and email. And that email on this particular website is where we capture user ID. Remember that we need to use user ID so we can sync the data. That was the user ID that we were mapping when we were testing data. And that same email, if we were to use it to capture from the website, will be then an email that will sync data between a profile, will match the profile between Mailchimp and Piwik PRO. So I'm going to click on register. Now I need to log in. And now let's go back to CDP. If I refresh that profile, if I go to that profile again, we now should be able to see additional information. So the fact that I'm using desktop, so all that are user attribute based on my visit to the website. So that is how we sync data between platforms that support webhooks. And we used Mailchimp as an example. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to our channel. Check the description below to find some useful links like free Piwik PRO sign up page, community forum page, and links to related videos. Until next time.